Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Worthy Web stream here. So I'm going to give a few minutes for people to sort of pop in here. But while we're waiting, I just thought I'd quickly explain, first of all, who I am. I'm TJ VanToll. I work as a developer advocate at Progress. And one thing we're doing this month, well, I think it's a little more than a month, is running a hackathon, the Progress Hack for Good Challenge. And I'm going to drop that link over here in the chat. So if you want to check it out, you can. So it's a hackathon. We're actually giving away quite a few prizes. So there's 40K US in prizes, so quite a bit. And you'll see that there's a few different prize categories. One of them is for the best use of KendoReact. And I work on the KendoReact team. So today's stream is going to be devoted to KendoReact. And specifically, we're going to talk about the KendoReact Grid, as it's the most used component as part of the library. And so this stream is intended to help people out that are participating in the hackathon, that want to try the grid and might have questions. So with that in mind, if you do have questions, feel free to hop in the chat at any point. I'm going to start going through the grid here in a minute and just talking through the basics. This is recorded as well, so if you need to hop out, I'll show you where you can find this. So if you follow the link that appeared in the chat and some air, so I'll just toss it there one more time just so we can see that. If you go to this resources section, you'll see that there's an entire category about this Worthy Web show. So you can see introductions or recordings of previous streams that we've done. So I did, along with friend Alyssa, we did an intro to KendoReact. It looks like April 6th, so about a month ago. So you can check out that recording. You can check out some other recordings from other people on our team that have been doing this. See that today we're doing a deep dive with the KendoReact Grid. So if you do need to hop off, you can get a link to this and check this out later on. All right. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about the KendoReact Grid. So what is the KendoReact Grid? Well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, if you need a full intro to KendoReact, you can check out the video. But just to give you the really quick version, KendoReact is basically a collection of premium React components. And there are a lot of components. And actually, if I scroll down here just to give you a sense of this, you'll see that there's components for everything from relatively simple things like building buttons, inputs, things like that, all the way up to things like really powerful form controls. You have things like date pickers, all the way up to components that really you can build entire applications around. So things like a full charting library. There's ways to make Gantt charts. And specifically, we're going to talk about the KendoReact data grid today, because it's easily our most used component. And it's one of those components that you really can easily build an entire application around. It's really powerful. There's a lot you can do with it. So we're going to dive into the data grid. We're going to check out how it works. We're going to play around with it. If you have any feature requests, feel free to just let those, drop those in chat, and we can dive into those. But let's just take a look at the data grid. And the data grid, so this is a page right here, and I'll drop this in the chat as well. This is a page that walks through the different features that the grid has. So just to give you a high level overview of what you can do before we get into the code, you can do things like you'd expect, like things like paging, sorting, filtering. You can group, which I think we'll dive into here in a minute, where basically if you have a bunch of grid rows and you want to say, I want to group these by all every column that has a certain value of this, I want to see all those grouped together. There's a way of doing that. You can do editable grids. So if you wanted to create just a way of for users to manage a collection of data, the grids are really good for that. You can do all sorts of things with columns. You can resize them. You can reorder them. Frozen columns, virtualization. If you have a grid that has a ton of content, either in rows or in grids, you can do that. You can export to Excel or PDF. This one is really handy if your users are working on just some collection of data and they need to output that to someone else at your company or whatever the case may be. You can quickly turn those into an Excel spreadsheet, PDF document. It's quite cool. As you can see, there's a lot here. So we're not going to be able to go through everything here just with the time that we have. So what I want to do is start with the basics, just show you how to get a grid up and running on a page. And then with whatever time we have left, we'll look into a few more these more advanced features, and then I'll take any requests that come in through chat if we want to dive into those things as well. All right, so what I want to do to start is I'm going to hit this See Demo button, which is going to take me over to the documentation portion of this. And I'll drop this. I was getting some weird error messages, so I'll just post this from other account there so that we can see this coming in. A link to this, which has an overview of the grid. Now, the way I like to use the KendoReact documentation is these grids are, oh, excuse me. The docs are very demo heavy, which I think is really awesome because you can see a lot of different scenarios and see basically completely built applications out there that you can take and that you can use. So in general, if you have like something, you're coming to this and you have a situation in mind, you might want to just look for a scenario on this grid that you can just use as the starting point of whatever you're building. Like if you know you're going to need PDF exporting, then you could take the PDF export demo and you can open this in StackBlitz. StackBlitz has a way of downloading this example. So you could essentially just use this as the starting point of your application to save you a bit of time. So that's something that's worth checking out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to start from absolutely nothing, right? So we're going to start from literally scratch. And so to do that, I'm going to go to my terminal and we'll even create a brand new app. So we'll just use create React app starter thing. We'll call this worthy web grid. We'll go ahead and let that start up in building this app. And when it comes to using KendoReact, what you'll want to do is on each components getting started page, which you'll see we're on the grids one right here, there's going to be a command that's going to tell you the npm packages that you need to install. So in this case, you see that we get the progress KendoReact Grid, as well as all of its dependencies here, which we'll copy this and we'll go ahead and install this once we're done. And we can open this thing up in VS Code, start to get set up here and get ready to code some stuff. So I will bring this up and we'll get ready to install this in just a second. And I also know you need it's the tree view as well. I'm going to need that, so I'll drop that in there and we'll wait for this to finish. It's getting close to done. And then what I'll also do while we're waiting is I'm just going to gut the starting point so that we are starting from absolutely nothing. We'll keep this really, really simple. So I'll take this. We'll even kill this class name. We don't really need any of this. Hello world in there so that we can see this is fine. Yeah, the install line. The thing about the grid is that it has quite a few different dependencies for doing things. Most of these things are quite small. So things like data query, this is like a really lightweight thing that we're actually going to use today for showing just how to massage data. Same thing for data tools. Same thing for internationalization that's built into it. There's one small one in here that's also for licensing. So it's just a mini utility that tracks different licensing. So a lot of these things are really small utilities, and we try to keep the library pretty modular. There are some packages here that are a little bit bigger, like for handling dropdowns and date inputs within the grid. And that's because the grid just leverages some of our components that we already have. So when you use like filtering within the grids, there's an ability to make dropdowns to make the filtering a little bit easier, some of the animations and such as well. But yeah, I sometimes wonder, like, there's some benefits of modularity of keeping this kind of spread out. But also at times it would be nice to just be able to say npm install KendoReact Grid as well. Isn't the import of React not necessary anymore? It is not. But what I'm going to do down here is I like spelling out. I don't know. I think you can do this, right? Use state. So we could use this approach as well. But I know that I'm going to end up needing some hooks from React. but we can keep it out for now because you're right, it isn't necessary. So we'll do this. We'll let this finish, and then I want to get just see the basics up, see hello world, and then once we see that, we'll start bringing in the grid and go from there. The other thing I can do while we're waiting for this is I did find online a data set that I want to work with. So the city of Toronto, of all places, has this public data set that they offer for different bike stations that they have around the city. And it's kind of very, very random, but it's a good data set for working on something like this. So I'm going to drop this into just a straight up JavaScript file. We'll keep this local to keep things simple, and we'll use this, but we might as well get that ready while we're waiting for things to install here and get up and going. And actually, while we're waiting, we could just start looking at what we need to do. So once this install is done, basically all we need to do is take the grid and import it. And then down in here, use it and pass it some data. So we could also grab those bike stations, data slash bike stations. Bring this in as well. So npm install is taking longer than it did. I was toying with this earlier and I didn't think it would take so long, but I should know better by this point, but I think it's got to be getting close to done. I should maybe use Yarn so I can, I believe Yarn does more to cache these things, because really it's kind of silly because all of this stuff should be cached because I build grid apps all the time. So I should have all of this installed and ready to go, but we'll let it do its thing. But this is essentially the starting point of the grid. You bring it in, you import it, you use it, and you pass it some data. And obviously things are going to get more complicated from that because there's a lot of different things we could do. And we're going to pick and choose a handful of these things from this list to go ahead and implement here momentarily once we're done installing. The other thing I've been joking about having on the stream, which I haven't done yet, is having some sort of just like little video or animation that plays during npm installs, just because this comes up all the time that we do this sort of thing and wait for npm to do its thing. That's all right. Can wait for it to finish. And once it does, we'll start it so I can bring up browser as well. The other thing I should mention, you'll see the warning in here about the Kendo UI license. So if you get this error, this Kendo UI license error, there's information that should get spit out somewhere in here. KendoReact license with information on how to set up your KendoReact license key. Basically, you just download this file and put it in your repo so that you no longer get a warning at all. But all right, we have our app, so we waited long enough for, J Van Allen, npm installs could bring down the whole internet. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's somewhat like recursive as well. It's taking longer than I expected to. All right, so I haven't saved any of my changes yet. So once I save this, we'll see if things worked. In theory, we should be seeing a KendoReact Grid. We'll see. Maybe I need a new like M1 Mac or something something that can process these things a little bit faster. Because now I'm stuck at there we go. Compile step. All right, there we go. So this is the default rendering of the KendoReact Grid, which obviously does not look very great and isn't all that interesting, but it is kind of cool in a sense that like I took this giant data set, and to show it on the screen, all I needed to do is pass it to this component and pass it in as this data. And you'll see that a couple things to notice right away. First of all, there's no theming or CSS here, which is one of the reasons why this looks just like a complete data dump right now. So we'll fix that first. And the second thing is, by default, it's going to take, the grid's going to take this JSON structure, which looks something like this. And it's just going to say like, okay, well, it looks like this is the title of the cell, and then this is the value. And it's going to sequentially go through this JSON structure and spit all of this stuff out. So the second thing we'll do, we'll make this look pretty. And then we'll also go through and tidy this up and put some more human readable terms and such on this as well. So let's clean up the look of this first. And when it comes to theming, if we go KendoReact theming, I think I spelled it wrong, but Google's got me covered. There are actually 3 different themes that you can use to style just KendoReact in general. So this applies to the grid as well. And there's a default theme, there's a bootstrap theme, and there is a material theme. And I happen to be a pretty big fan of the material one. So that's the one I'm going to use here. But you can use any one you want. And there's also a KendoReact theme builder, which is here, that basically allows you to take the theme so you can get a sense of the color palette that the theme uses. And there's a whole thing where you can essentially configure the colors to match what you want to use. So if you want to check this out, I'll drop this off. DataStax, is this the first session? So what we're doing is, this is, let's see, Worthy Web. So at Progress, we're holding this hackathon called the Worthy Web stream. And there's a number of different streams that we're doing as a part of this. And this one, if I go to resources and go to this show, so if you go to this resources section, you'll see I already did an intro to KendoReact earlier that you can check the recording out of. And today we're focusing on the grid just because the grid is a pretty integral part of a lot of applications. It's our most used component. So we're diving into that in a little more detail. So if you want to, you can check out the intro to KendoReact first and then come back to this. So we'll update this with a recording at a later date as well. All right, so we have our theme. I know that the other thing that we need for the material theme is, and this is just straight up Google stuff. Google has a font, the Roboto Font, that is the font that material theme uses. So I'm going to paste that in. We'll grab a cool title like Grid Rocks and toss that in there. And we now have our theme installed. Oops, I didn't need to type npm install, just needed to start. But while we're waiting, I know I also need to install the import. So I'm going to need this line of code as well. And we'll toss this in here. And we're not using the default theme. We're using the material one. So we'll save this. We'll start this back up. The themes also, they're written in Sass. So if you're a Sass person, you can get at like the raw Sass. And you can also like this, you wouldn't want to use all that CSS in a production app because it contains all of KendoReact styling for all like 80 some components, which as you might imagine is quite big. So if you just check out the documentation, there's information on customizing the themes. If you want to use Sass, you can be more granular. Like this is probably what you want. You want to only import the grid styles to keep things kind of lean. But for our case, this is an hour-long demo. We're just going to bring in all of it, and that's good enough for teaching purposes. So we have this in. Let's get this out of the way. So now with the theme, we should have a grid that still has the ugly sort of data processing, but at least now we have some nice looker spacing and fonts and colors and such. And I think I'm also going to add just a little bit of padding here just to space things out a little bit. And now we can start talking about the data itself. So like I said, by default, the grid's just going to, if you just pass it just raw JSON, there's only so much you can figure out. It's basically just doing a data dump like here's all your keys, here's all your values. Good luck, right? And we'll just toss this in a massive structure. So what we want to do instead is say, okay, so that's our grids data, but we need to actually pass the grid some information. So in addition to working with the grid, we're also going to work with grid column. And grid column. And you need to pass this thing, I think it's field and title, or at least that's the simplest things to use. And if I bring up my bike stations again, where did those go? Drag those down here. I can say such stuff like, I want for the field of station ID, I want to show ID. And when I save that, so now because I'm passing a grid column, the grid's like, oh, this is the only thing you want to show. It says, look at this field in the JSON file and show it with a column heading of, in this case, ID. And so let's do that. 3, 4. And let's grab a few more of these. So like bikes available. I don't know, how many bikes are disabled? How many docks are available? If it's a charging station, what's its status? Sure, we can do that. And then maybe zone. And then I'm going to take a second to just clean up these titles. We'll make it look decent. Charging station. This is docks available. Bikes disabled. And bikes available. And we'll see as long as we didn't screw that up. Yeah, so now we have a grid that actually looks somewhat decent, right? So I could probably be a little bit smarter about how I did these titles or mess with CSS so they wrap or whatever, but this looks halfway decent, just in terms of a decent looking grid. But you see that it's also a absolutely massive grid. Apparently the city of Toronto has a number of different, or actually quite a few different bike stations. So I want to start to customize this and do some interesting sort of different and fun things. And the cool thing to know with KendoReact is really like anything you see is configurable, which is kind of slick. So to show you one of those right away, the one thing that stands out to me, at least when looking at this, is true and false, showing that like if this were a user-facing grid, showing true or false is not the greatest user experience. That's probably what we don't, it's probably not what we want to show. So one thing you can do is for any column, you can essentially pass a cell prop that lets you more or less override how KendoReact renders the individual cell. Meaning if I go up here and we have our custom cell and we go and return some silliness like this, all of a sudden when I change this, the cell now uses this path. Essentially, I've now taken control of this. And actually, it looks kind of weird because there actually should be table cells. So if I put this in there, I now have control over how this renders. So I could, so this gets some props. And I think if I were using TypeScript here, so another thing with KendoReact is we provide really, really good TypeScript support. So if you're a TypeScript person, you get a lot of the benefits of autocomplete and such. I'm going to stick with JavaScript right now just to keep things kind of simple, but actually it might help me figure these things out because the individual cell, I know it gets past the data item. So in this case, this would be like the object in the JSON that this cell is for. And I think props gets past field as well. So field being like in this case is going to be is charging station. And so what I can do is I can say, based off whether this is true or not, I can say either yes or no. And yep, that worked. Yes or no instead of true or false to make this a little bit nicer. I could be even more clever. I could like make these cells either green or red. If I wanted to, I could show like a custom icon. Maybe I have 3 different states. I could even make this cell reusable. Like really, I should probably not call this custom cell. This is really more like Boolean cell, because these things are reusable. So if I had another Boolean that I wanted to use in this way, I could do this. And I personally, I think this is really slick, because this to me is one of the best parts of React, is that React makes little components like this really easy to create and use. So I find this kind of elegant. And we use this approach for a lot of what we do throughout the entire library. So for example, this one came from this cells section of the documentation. And this is a grid cell. So this is basically the docs where you can find this information. But you can also configure, like I said, like pretty much anything you see. So the header cells, the footer cells. So if you wanted to add a footer to your grid, you wanted to show like totals down there, that's something you can do. You can control the header cells if you had something specific in mind in terms of rendering. You don't like the default look and you wanted to add some additional things up there. You have total control over that. You can add tooltips. Is this a tooltip one? This is like additional props that you can pass as well. So a lot of this, and you'll see this is going to be a recurring theme as we go throughout this and we start to make this grid more complicated, is that you have like sort of these little extensibility hooks into everything we do, just in case you need to tweak it, because we also know that the grid provides a whole lot, or people use the grid for a lot of complex things. Oh, and hey, C# Fritz. Awesome. Thanks for the raid, man. Hope everything went well with your stream. Thanks everybody for tuning in. What we're doing today is we're talking about the KendoReact Grid. So if you are not aware, we are doing a pretty big hackathon here at Progress called the Worthy Web Hackathon. And I'll drop this in the chat again. Yeah, thanks, Fritz. So the hackathon, I just dropped it in the chat. It's a hackathon we're doing here at Progress. We're giving away quite a bit, like 40K in prizes. So it's something that you might want to check out. And we have a number of different prize categories for things like using the best use of Blazor, best use of Kendo UI for Angular, best use of KendoReact and such. So I'm TJ VanToll. I work on the KendoReact team. So today, as part of this hackathon, if I go over to the, I think it's the resources section of this, we're doing a number of different streams that you can check out here. And today I'm covering the KendoReact Grid, just because the grid, some of you might know this, but grids sometimes end up being entire applications because the grid can do a whole lot. So we've been starting pretty simple, right? Like this isn't super complex. I found a data set online of bike stations in the city of Toronto because for some reason they made this public, and it's a handy data set to work with. And so really all you've missed so far is we brought in the grid. So we installed it from NPM. We tied it into these bike stations. And we've been looking at just, first of all, how to get a rendering that looks pretty nice. So we cleaned up the columns a little bit. And we also started to dig into extensibility. Like you can provide these little like custom hooks. So instead of showing true or false in this column, we're now showing yes or no. So just showing how you can get these little extensibility hooks to build something kind of powerful and sort of tweak the grid. And we're going to look at some additional examples of this. And actually, I think the next thing we're going to do to make this thing more complex is you'll see this grid. There's a lot here, like a lot. Apparently, Toronto has a lot of bike stations. So this is something that could probably benefit from something like paging. So I did want to show paging. And like everything else, if you go to the KendoReact documentation for the grid, you'll see that there's a paging section. And in this case, there's a set of steps right off the top that I'll walk us through how to do, building on top of this existing structure. This first step is quite simple. Set the pageable prop for the grid. This will be one of the easiest steps we'll have to do today. So VS Code is helping me out. It's telling me that this thing exists, and it's a Boolean. So all I got to do is set it to true. And so now our grid is pageable. For better or worse, that's not the only thing we need to do. There's a couple of additional steps that we need to take to tell the grid specifically how to page, because if you think about paging, there's a number of different ways you could potentially implement it, not just page size, but also like what the UI should look like, how things should be handled. Is your data local or server side? So there are some additional things that we need to configure. The first is these two props called skip and take. And I'm going to explain these. They're kind of fun sounding names. So I'm just going to type them out first, and then we'll talk about what they do. So we'll do skip, set skip, and it's going to be React.useState. And I still use semicolons. I know it's kind of the hip thing to do to not use semicolons, but I think I'll die on that hill. It's like muscle memory for me to type semicolons. I don't know where everybody else is on that, but like I can't complete a line of code without typing one. I'll bring in React so this works. So we have skip and take, and I'm also going to pass these things in. So skip equals skip, take equals take. And the way to think about this is essentially you're telling your code, or you're telling the pager within KendoReact, first of all, how many records should I skip? So by default, you're going to want to skip 0 because you don't want to start at some arbitrary point. But after the user pages, let's say your page size is like 10, then you would want to skip 10, or that's at least how to conceptually think about this. Take is essentially page size. I think we actually also offer page size, which is probably a cleaner way of handling this. But take is just how many you should take. So skip 0 and take 10 rows, and then we pass in the grid to tell it this. And we'll see what this looks like in a minute. And then the grid also wants a total, which we have the total as well. So we have bike stations length. So we will pass that in. And the next thing it says, you need to handle either the on-page change or on-data state change. And there's this bit in here too that says the on-data state change event is recommended. And we'll see why in a second. I'm actually going to start with the page change just because it's going to be a little easier. And then you'll see why we're going to want to move on to the data state change in a minute, just because it can handle more complex situations. But we're still keeping this simple. So we'll say on page change. I happen to know this thing gets an event. And if you didn't know this demo would spell this out for you in great detail. Like I said, one of the easiest ways to learn KendoReact is just to look at the source of some of this existing stuff and take a look at this. So this thing gets an event, and it gets passed. I think it's actually, I will look at the code. We'll cheat here. It's event.page. So the page.skip, and set the take event. That page, that take. And again, if I were smart enough to use Typescript, then I would get some additional help here, so I wouldn't have to guess at these prop names. But we're using JavaScript. We're keeping it simple. And then I need to pass this in on page change. And we will call that. And if we go back to our steps, the last one is, so page the data on the client using the select method or our built-in process method. So this data can also be paged on the server. So the last thing we need to tell the grid is basically now, by default, we are passing the grid all of the bike stations, which before paging made a total sense because we just wanted to say, show them all, show all the bike stations on the screen. But now we want these bike stations to be derived based off of where the user's at in the paging system. So at KendoReact, we provide a method called process to help with this. And we'll look at that in a minute because process can help when things get complicated. But when things are still relatively simple, one thing you can do, and I believe this code is doing it down here, is just use the built-in JavaScript array methods for handling this. So instead I can say, slice the bike stations, or essentially chop this up into just a bit of the array. And we'll want to start by however many we're skipping. And then we'll want to take, and there's the take plus the skip. And if we did all of this correctly, which hopefully we did, fingers crossed, we should now have a grid. So this is the same grid, but now with these handful of lines of code, we're now able to page this. All of these paging controls work out of the box. I can pick and poke around this arbitrarily. I can change this, the take, if I want to mess with a page size. I've got a big enough monitor to show a little bit more of this, so we could bump this up to 15 and still page around and still work with this. So this is the basic structure for paging. And if these bike stations, so this is all local. So if you are just joining us, we're using some bike stations data, and it's just hard coded in this JavaScript file here. But in most situations, you're probably going to be working with data that lives on a server somewhere, and not just some really big JSON file. So in that case, your data would be something that you would store in state here. And every time the page changed, you would have to then call off to your server through some sort of fetch call or some sort of service call that says, okay, you pass the server this information. The server, you tell it, okay, the user wants to skip this many and take this many. Your server would do whatever logic it needed. It would pass it back. And then your code back here would be something like set data. And VS Code is typing weird things for me. But essentially, you would say set data to whatever came back from the server right here. But if your data is local, this approach works where you're just essentially slicing up a data set here locally so you can control what shows in the grid. All right, make sure, all right, just looking around, make sure any questions came in. So feel free to, if you have any questions about how this works or you want to see anything different, we can show or cover whatever here today. So feel free to chime in with anything you want to see. But what I do want to cover is you'll note that this talked about this on data state change event and this built-in process method. And the reason that we're going to switch to use this here in a minute is this paging stuff is fairly straightforward until you want to start using other features of the grid sort of in conjunction with paging. So imagine you want to do paging, but you also want to do sorting, or you also want to do filtering, or you also want to do grouping, and you also want to do editing. Well, suddenly managing all this stuff can get quite a bit harder, or there's more moving pieces to deal with. So the data state is sort of our attempt at building a consolidated place to store information like skip, take, and then eventually like filters and groups sort of stuff as well to make your life a little bit easier. So let's look at, I guess we could do like filtering, how we can add this to this approach to take care of filtering while maintaining paging, while keeping paging working as well. So the question in chat, I'm honestly lost on why take needs to add how many you skip. Let's say I have something, so like this portion on here, I think this is because, so slice, the JavaScript slice method says start at a given index and take this many. So I think that the reason it's doing this is, and we can play with this. So if I have like, well, we can keep the index, right? 2, 3, 4. And then if I do numbers.slice, so if my skip is, we're doing like a page size of 2, and I want to take 2. So if I'm slicing from skip, that's saying start at 2. I'm going to end up confusing myself out of all this because I think, just to see if we can figure out how slice works here. Because if I'm saying I want to start at 0 and take 2, I would expect to get 2 numbers out of here, which I do. You think you got it? All right. Yeah. It's confusing. That's why I almost wish like, part of me says like there's got to be a cleaner way of doing this. And I think it is easier when the data is on the server, because then you're passing this stuff to the server to sort of take care of this and figure it out. And these almost turn into like parts of an SQL query sort of thing, or whatever database that you happen to be using. So this line of code just doesn't exist. This is really only used with like local data. And I've always thought the JavaScript array methods like slice, then there's also splice, I believe. Like I believe that's a thing. JavaScript splice method. Yeah, so you get like, I love like splice versus slice, right? Versus, I think shift is a thing, right? So I don't know. I mean, all languages have some issues with this, but this is this thing that always confuses me. And yeah, I think it is index to index. All right. So let's work on it. Oh, one thing I should mention in paging before we move on to doing filtering. I mentioned this would come up multiple times throughout this, but once again, everything you see about this grid is configurable. So that also applies to this paging section down here. So in general, we try to provide intelligent defaults. Like this is probably like the most common paging implementation that you want. But if you don't like it, you can provide your own, you can implement your own custom pager. So there's ways of, there's this pager settings thing. So if you wanted to have like an input down here, you could do that. And then, like I said, there's also ways of doing a completely custom pager. So if you just said, I want total control over what my paging looks like and how it works, and I have this thing in mind, that's also an option for you. There's, I believe it's, you just pass in like pager. Yeah. So you pass in pager, you pass in a React component, and we pass all the information about like what the current page is, and then it's up to you to totally provide the rendering. Yeah, as a backend dev, this is really confusing. Yeah, even for someone like me that's a front-end developer, this sort of stuff can get confusing as well. So it's not just you. And I think that's the one thing, like especially with the grid, like the grid is kind of designed to solve hard problems in a sense. Like even like for this sort of thing, the grid is like, it kind of provides a nice output here, but really like most people use the grid for, they've got some really advanced use case in mind. Like I have this data and my users really need to be able to like edit it, filter through it, sort it in this really custom way. And so it's somewhat complicated by like necessity because it's solving a hard problem. So I don't know, I struggle and go back and forth on that sort of thing as well. All right, I want to show filtering and how we can make this work. And so just so you know what filtering is before we go into showing this, is essentially KendoReact can automatically provide these little filter controls at the top of the screen. So you can say like, I want to find all things that contain this string. There's also like different things you can do, like contains or is equal to, not equal to, is empty. If you have numbers, like I want to think, like imagine you're looking through a product list and say, I want to find all things that cost less than $10 sort of thing. KendoReact can help you just automatically generate the UI for users to show this stuff, and then also filter the data itself so that the data the user is actually seeing reflects the filters that they've created. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish. We're going to try to also do that while keeping our paging in place also. So temporarily, I'm going to kill this information and we'll bring it back. We'll just leave that we do want this to be pageable. We are going to want the total. I'm actually going to clear this out as well because we're going to take a different approach to this that's going to scale a little bit better. So we're going to back all this out. So essentially, we're back at our starting point. We just have a basic grid. There is no paging. We've got tens of thousands of rows or whatever the case might be. And so this time, we're going to take a different approach. Just bring it up. Hey, I'm horrible with names, but Ophiacine, that I probably mispronounced. Thanks for coming, hanging out. We're talking about the KendoReact Grid here today. And we are going to follow the guide here that says, first of all, we need to set filterable to be true. So we're going to do that. We'll set it to true. The filtering conditions. So there's ways that you can tell like different grid columns what sort of filtering should be done. Like, so KendoReact knows, hey, this is a date column, so I should be showing date filters. This is numeric, so I should be showing numeric filters. So we'll come back to that in a minute. The part I want to focus on is this on data state change when things happen, and then also this data set property that we want to store. So instead of storing stuff that's very specific to paging, instead, I'm going to come up here and store two different things. So I'm going to store the data state, which this is also sometimes I think not the greatest name because this is really storing all of the things that could affect the state of the grid itself. So what I mean by that is, actually it'll be a little more obvious when I put in the starting values. So my state will be things like that skip and take that we had earlier. And this could also then be used to store like filters and grouping and other things, but these are things that are applied to the grid itself or different pieces of state. So this is kind of like a internal thing for the grid to keep track of that information. And then the other thing we're going to store is a result. And this is actually going to be, if I get this started here, I need a dot. What we'll use, instead of just doing that slicing that we were doing sort of in line, instead we'll just pass this the result. So essentially we're going to do our processing of handling all of the paging and filtering at a different level, and the grid's just going to keep track of this result. And actually, you'll notice that the docs here refer to this process method, and that's actually what we're going to use to do this. So I'm going to import that, and it's from at progress, Kendo, is it just Kendo data query? Yeah, I think it's this. And what process does is it essentially says, okay, so we'll call this thing, and we'll see how good the documentation is. So first of all, it wants data, so the data to be processed. So in this case, that's bike stations. So we have a big list of bike stations. The second thing it wants is essentially the data state. So we call it state because we want the data state. So the operation descriptors that will be applied to the data. So it's going to be this data state. And operation descriptors is like a fancy way of saying like all the pieces of metadata that's tracking the state of the grid, sort of thing. Hey, Kevin, how's it going? We're just trying to get a grid working here. All right, so we have that. And the next thing to go through this list, so we have process on here. We also need to handle this on data state change. So on data state change, and I like just calling these methods the same thing. So we need to handle when any sort of data state updates. And this thing gets an event again. And essentially what I need to do is update two things. I need to update the data state, and I need to update the result. And the result, actually, I again call process. I'm going to process all the bike stations again, but this time I'm going to process the result of this based off of whatever happened in the event. So the idea here is something in the UI will change, like the user hits a paging button or whatever the case may be. And KendoReact is going to say, oh, okay, something about the state of this grid changed, so I need to call this event handler. And it's going to pass it the updated version of whatever changed. So like a new skip or take or page size or whatever the case may be. So we need to update the result or the data that's going to show in this grid to account for that. And KendoReact provides this process method to make our life a little bit easier. And the other thing we need to do is set the actual data state. So this, I believe, is just going to be the same data state, just so that's tracked and will live to the next occurrence of this. And in theory, if we typed everything correctly, which hopefully we did, we should now have not only paging, so we have paging as part of this grid. And actually, did our page size change when we, that's kind of weird. Our page size started at 15 and then it went to 10, and I'm not sure why that happened. Maybe something we can look at here in a minute. I might have typoed something. But the other thing we should be able to do, I might have also like created a loop or something because my browser is slowed down completely. Yeah, we screwed something up because the filters are also not working. But we got closer because we now see filters up on the screen. And so we just got to figure out what we're doing incorrectly here. So we're skipping, we have data state, we're skipping 10, skipping 0, taking 15. And we have a result that's set to process the bike stations with the data state. When the data state changes, oh, okay. Well, I know why we're losing this information, because we also need to pass in the data state into the component itself. 3 dots. So we'll do that here. So that's why the page state was getting lost, because essentially we need to still pass this information to, and this tab is toast. So we'll start another one up. So we have our paging, which looks like it's being preserved now. So now we just got to see whether our filtering works as well. So let's say we want to see all bikes in the west zone. Yeah, I think that worked. So now I can see bikes in the west zone. I can clear this. I can see like all stations that have docks available. If I wanted to see, I think I screwed that one up. I think that's because we're providing a custom cell here, we need to do a little bit more work to make sure we're working with the filter. So that's why that happened there. So off the top of my head, I can't remember what APIs we need for handling that. But you'll notice that the filters still aren't super optimized for what we're doing. Like, it's not the greatest that the user has to type these in. So that goes back to this bit that was talking about here of the like filtering descriptions and making the grid a little bit smarter based off the data that you're using. So if we go down in here, you'll see there's some additional things you can pass. Like you can say filterable false. And like, so for our ID, that's something we probably want to do, because we don't need users to filter based off the ID of these stations. And you can also tell the grid about the different types that are here. So for example, we wanted to say like number of bikes available. This would be a Eric. I always type num Eric. This is a numeric field. And you'll see now I can do things like find the number of bikes available, and I get this nice control. There are also ways that you can go kind of crazy here. Like you can provide a filter that's built into the column. You can provide like total, like complete cells down here. So for example, if we wanted to filter probably for our zones, a drop down here would be really nice, so that we could show the different zones and let the user filter based on those. Custom filter operators. Like I said, there's quite a bit here that you can do. And just to get at our greater point is basically anything you see about the grid is something that you can change or update. But what I did want to show is how by sort of using this data state approach to track like all the metadata about the grid itself, it gives you flexibility to implement some of these other features and start to sort of compose up a pretty powerful grid. All right. So why don't we, if anybody has a favorite feature that they want to see, feel free to drop it in chat. Otherwise, I'm just going to pick one or two more of these out of at random. Actually, why don't we do grouping? Because I think this is kind of handy as well. And I think it shows how this data state approach makes implementing some of this more advanced stuff quite simple and easy. So grouping, if you haven't seen this before, it's kind of crazy. So let's say you have a grid of data and you want to see, okay, there's all this stuff, but I actually want to see, I only care about beverages. Like that's all I care to see. So what I can do is I can take this category name and drag it up here. And all of a sudden I have this full list. It looks like they're all beverages. So that's less than helpful. But basically you can see a list of everything that's grouped by that specific type. And implementing this, once you have this sort of basic structure, so it took us a while to get here and we've made a few mistakes along the way. But once you get this structure set up, it's actually quite powerful in just how much you can get done in a small amount of code. So in this case, if we just look at the code here, just to see what they want. So what was the first step? You need the groupable and group options. So actually, we don't even need this group option per se. I can explain what that's doing in a minute. but I need to set the grid for now groupable. So we're now pageable, we are filterable, and we are groupable. And actually, I don't even know if we need to do anything else, because since we already have this on data state change handler set up here, and this is already in place, and we're already set up to sort of preserve our data set, one thing I can do is, I think, if I just like drag zone up here, yeah, you can see that we're now automatically grouping this information by zone. And I think this will be easier to see if we make this no longer pageable. So if we kill the paging and refresh, I don't know, I've had some weird issues today with things not refreshing. We can do a totally new tab here. If we do by zone, you can see that we have, and actually we also need kill these as well because we're being artificially limited here. So we have our massive data set. We tell it, I want to group these things by zone. We drop this in, and now all of a sudden, here's all of our east stuff. And if we scroll down, we have, apparently there's only one bike station in the north and one in the south. Toronto's got to get on that. But it provides an easy way of grouping this information. You can undo this. You could group by other things as well. Like if you wanted to see which ones have, bikes disabled and such. You can also set this, like if you cared about the starting state of this, you could set that up in here. That's actually what this group property is doing. So if you wanted to group these things by zone by default, you could say group, and you could say the field is zone. And by putting it in this sort of starting state, you'll see that the grid just starts with the zone preserved. And you could also do things like this data state, because it's sort of tracking the metadata of the grid itself. This is something you could also maybe like store in local storage. So if you wanted the user to be able to use your grid to do some sort of advanced things, they wanted to get their data to look exactly like they want, certain filters applied, certain bits of grouping, aggregating sort of applied, you could take this data state, and every time it changes, you could do like local storage, that set item, data state. Data state, I think you have to like stringify it. And then you could set its starting value to like parse it out of local storage to preserve some of those, almost like a setting for the user. So that's something that you could do as well. So pretty cool. And hopefully you can see the power of storing things in this data state. And we're coming up on our time. So I do want to ask chat, if you have anything specifically you want to see, now's a great time to drop that in. Or if you have any final questions, do that. But if I don't see anything, I'm just going to drop a few last reminders. I'll drop the link to the Worthy Web Challenge in here one more time, just in case you want to check this out. You want to be eligible for entering the hackathon, for try to win some prizes. I'll again drop a link to the grid. Let's just go to the overview page here if you want to check this out. And I'll also mention that if you do miss any of these, we're doing these streams called the Worthy Web Show, and this link will take you right to it. So if you want to check out the recording of this, if you want to see the earlier session I did on KendoReact with my friend Alyssa, this is up here. If you want to see some of the other sessions that we've done, we've had a few of us at Progress doing these. We've also got some upcoming ones. Ed's going to be doing the grid, but Blazor style, so you can judge him to see if he's doing a more interesting thing than Kendo Surprise or than KendoReact. I was reading ahead because then Alyssa is doing the surprise 2 weeks from now. So we have a lot of fun stuff coming up. So that link is in the chat as well. I'm not seeing any other messages, so I think I'm going to call it here. As I said one last time, if you want to check the recording of this, this will be on YouTube. We'll also link this up here. But if not, good luck hacking. Hopefully you're successful with the KendoReact Grid. If you do have any other questions too, I'm TJ VanToll on Twitter. You can feel free to reach out. My DMs are open and such, so you can feel free to reach out with any questions that came up. But if not, thanks for joining me. Appreciate it, and best of luck.